Aloha colleagues, this is Dr. Gibson. Welcome to OC 6005, Scope and Methods of Research. The title of this. Before we get started, I do want to point out some resources that are available to you. First off, I've added a few files to this week's page for your review. The articles are not assigned reading, so I want to emphasize that. However, they're very helpful how-to guides, and I will be going over the general points of those articles in this particular presentation. Also, I've included an exemplary article from Administrative Science Quarterly, which is one of the top journals in organizational research. And this particular article uses a grounded theory approach to content analysis. This article is also not required reading, but I do encourage you to browse through it. So the article's title is The Storytelling Organization, a Study in Performance at an Office Supply Firm by Dr. David M. Boji. I believe the article is when he was still at Loyola Marymount. He's now at New Mexico State University. So going over the different data types that we can utilize in content analyses, we did discuss this in the previous presentation, but it's a good reminder to look at how flexible this methodology is. So in particular, you can utilize content analysis for open-ended questions and written comments on questionnaires, testimonials, individual interviews, discussion groups, or focus group interviews, journals and diaries, documents, reports, news articles, stories, case studies, certainly social media. There are many different types of data that you can utilize this method with. And also a reminder that data can be verbal or written, which again opens a few doors in terms of the type of data that we can analyze. So this presentation is basically going to go through a quick how-to analysis guide. The first step is getting to know your data. Step 2, focus the analysis. Apparently I have an update in Office that I need to do as well. Step 3 is code information. Step 4, identify problems and connections within and between categories. And finally, step 5, the interpretation or bringing it all together. So we will go through each of these steps in depth in the next few steps. The first step in this process is getting to know your data. So what does that even mean? Please remember that good analysis depends on understanding the data. So for our purposes, this means you read, reread, and then read the text again. So I recommend that you do this multiple times. I also suggest that you spend some time reading your data and then take a few days off and don't do anything with your data, and then come back to it again with a fresh mindset and fresh eyes so you can see different things in there. If you have audio recordings, this is where you would listen to those recordings several times. At this point, you're going to want to write down any impressions you have as you go through the data. And these impressions can inform the direction of the analysis and contribute to a more effective and streamlined analysis. The next step in the process is step 2, focus your analysis. How you focus your analysis depends on the purpose of the evaluation and how you will use the results. So there are 2 approaches that you can utilize to focus your analysis. The first one is focus by question or topic, time period, or event. So this approach is often used with open-ended questions. You organize the data by question to look across all the respondents and their answers in order to identify consistencies and differences. You put all the data from each question together. You can apply the same approach to particular topics or a time period or even an event of interest. Later on, you may want to explore the connections and relationships between questions, so things such as topics, time periods, events, etc., etc. The second way that you can focus your analysis is by case, individual, or group. So you may want an overall picture of, say, one case, such as one work group or one department, one individual, such as a junior exec or a line worker, or even one group, such as all new employees within the last 2 years. So rather than grouping these respondents' answers by question or topic, you can organize the data from or about the case, the individual, or the group, and analyze it as a whole. Please also note that you can also combine these two approaches. Step 3 in the process is coding the information, and what this means is we are bringing meaning to the words in your data set. So this process will help us identify themes or patterns. So those are things such as certain ideas, concepts, behaviors, interactions, incidents, terminology, certain phrases that may be used numerous times in the data. And then we organize them into coherent categories. So we're summarizing and bringing meaning to the text by assembling them together so we can have a better understanding of the data. It's important that you understand that this can be a fairly labor-intensive process, depending on the amount of data that you have. But this is essentially what qualitative analysis is all about. It involves reading and rereading the text and then identifying coherent categories. So continuing on, you're going to need to assign abbreviated codes of a few letters. You could also utilize short words or symbols, and then place them next to the themes and ideas that you find. So this is going to help you organize the data into categories. You then provide a descriptive label, and I call it a name here, for each category that you create. So be clear about what you include in the category and what you exclude. So as you categorize the data, you might identify other themes that serve as subcategories. And then continue to categorize until you've identified and labeled all relevant themes. So if you look at the example that I have provided here, question 1 asks, what makes a quality educational program? And then the column in the right, it says categories, responses to the question, or how the responses to the question were sorted. And we utilize staff, relevance, participation, timeliness, and content. So those were the different categories that we identified from the data in this particular example. Essentially, there are two main ways to categorize narrative data. And the first way is utilizing preset categories, which is what we are doing for this class. So we started with a list of themes or categories in advance and then searched the data for these topics. So we're using this approach because you've developed a research question for the scenario and you're looking for those specific elements in your data. The other way that you can categorize narrative data is emergent categories. So rather than using preconceived themes or categories, you read through the text and you find themes or issues that recur in the data. So these become your categories. They may be ideas or concepts that you had not thought about. So this approach allows the categories to emerge from the data. Categories are defined after you've worked with the data or as a result of working with it. So sometimes you may want to combine those two approaches. So starting with some preset categories and adding others as they become apparent. So your initial list of categories may change as you work with the data. So please note that this is an iterative process. You may have to adjust the definition of your categories or identify new categories to accommodate the data that do not fit the existing labels. Main categories are broken into subcategories. Then you'll need to resort your data into these smaller, more defined categories. So this allows for greater discrimination and differentiation. And if you look at the example provided on the right-hand portion of your screen, for the question, what is the benefit of a youth mentoring program? The first time that we started coding, we identified 4 main categories, and that was benefits to youth, benefits to mentor, benefits to family, and benefits to community. But upon reflecting on the data and going through it several more times, we really found that the benefits to youth category included a lot more information that we weren't capturing with just one main category. So we were able to extract 4 subcategories, and those were benefits to youth in terms of school performance, friendship, self-concept, and role modeling. So while you want to try to create mutually exclusive and exhaustive categories, sometimes sections of data fit into 2 or more categories, so you may need to create a way to cross-index those. Here we have an example from a workshop, and this is part of an open-ended survey questions that were passed out to the participants at the end of the workshop. And in particular, there were 21 respondents to this survey. And in particular, we're looking at question 5. And that question states, what do you need next to continue your learning about evaluation? So this workshop was teaching individuals about assessment and evaluation of programs. So what we did is we took the 21 responses, we transcribed them here, and then as we went through them, we identified 7 categories that the data classify into. And those 7 categories are practice, additional training, time, resources, feedback, mentor, and uncertain. And then right after each category on the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see the code that we utilize to denote those categories. On the example page, you'll see how we categorized each response here. You'll also notice that question 7 is left uncoded. Now this person responded yes to this question, but in the context of the question, which states what do you need next to continue your learning about evaluation, the word yes doesn't give us any usable information. So that was taken out of our data set. Step 4 is to identify patterns and connections between the categories. So as you organize the data into categories, either by question or by case, for example, you will begin to see patterns and connections both within and between the categories. So you are assessing the relative importance of different themes or highlighting subtle variations that may be important to your analysis. We are going to talk about 4 different ways to assess your categories and data. Those methods are within category description, larger categories, relative importance, and relationships. And we are going to go into beginning with the within category description. You may be interested in summarizing the information pertaining to one particular theme or capturing the similarities or differences in people's responses within a category. So to do this, you need to assemble all the data pertaining to that particular category. And the questions that you need to ask yourself as you are evaluating the data are, for example, what are the key ideas being expressed within this category? Or what are the similarities and differences in the way people responded, including the subtle variations? It's also very helpful to write a summary for each category that describes these points. When we are talking about larger categories, it's possible that you may want to create a larger, or what we call super categories, that combine several categories. So for example, in the face-to-face section, one of the students was interested in looking at job satisfaction, but in trying to understand how job satisfaction can impact an employee's overall well-being. So you may want to collapse some of the smaller constructs into a category that explains something bigger. In this example, it's employee well-being. So you can work up from more specific categories to larger ideas or concepts. And then you can see how the part. The next method is to look at the relative importance. And to do this, you may be interested in showing which categories appear more important. You may wish to count the number of times a particular theme comes up, or the number of unique respondents who refer to certain themes. So these counts provide a very rough estimate of the relative importance, and it needs to be pointed out that they're not suited to statistical analysis, but they can reveal some general patterns in the data. The last methodology is discussing relationships. And you may also discover that 2 or more themes tend to occur together consistently in the data. So whenever you find one, you tend to find the other. An example here would be youth with divorced parents consistently list friendship as the primary benefit of the mentoring program. You may also decide that some of these connections suggest a cause and effect relationship or create a sequence through time. So for example, respondents may link improved school performance to a good mentor program. So from this, you might argue that good mentoring causes improved school performance. However, these connections are important to look for because they can help explain why something occurs. But please, please be careful about simple cause and effect interpretations. So seldom is human behavior or narrative data so simple. So in the example in the previous slide that suggested good mentoring programs lead to good school performance, for example, there may be many other variables that contributed to an individual's performance, and it would be very difficult to suggest with 100% certainty that a good mentoring program was the sole cause of good school performance. So as you're investigating these relationships, some questions that you need to ask yourself are: how do things relate? What data support this interpretation? And what other factors may be contributing? So at this point, you may wish to develop a table or illustrate relationships across two or more categories. Specifically, you're going to want to look for examples of responses or events that run counter to the prevailing themes. So what do these countervailing responses suggest? And are they important to the interpretation and understanding? So often you learn a great deal from looking at and trying to understand items that do not fit in. So the final step in our content analysis process is interpretation and bringing it all together. So you're going to use your themes and connections to explain your findings. So essentially we are trying to answer the questions: what does it all mean, and what is really important? So this is what we call interpreting the data. You'll hear this term used a lot in the literature. So we are essentially attaching meaning and significance to the analysis. So a good place to start is to develop a list of key points or important findings you discovered as a result of categorizing and sorting your data. So I recommend stand back and think about what you've learned. This may be a good point in time to take a break from data analysis. You may want to put the data down for a few days, even up to a week, so you can really reflect on what you learned from your analysis. So specifically, some questions you will want to answer are: what are the major lessons? What new things did you learn? What has application to other settings or programs or studies? And what will those who use the results of the evaluation be most interested in knowing? So specifically, as you are interpreting the data, you're going to want to synthesize your findings. It's really easy to get bogged down in all the small nuances that you learn from your data, but be sure and paint a picture with your words as you synthesize your findings. So I suggest developing an outline for presenting your results to other people, or if you're writing a final report, an outline is going to help you organize your ideas. At this point, it's often helpful to include some quotations or descriptive examples to illustrate your points and to bring the data to life. Also, a visual display might help communicate the findings. I've seen diagrams with boxes and arrows, and that can certainly help show how all the pieces fit together. So creating such a model may reveal some gaps in your investigation and connections that may remain unclear. So these may be areas that you can suggest further. I do want to take a moment and go over some of the nuts and bolts of narrative analysis. So moving from a mass of words to a final report requires a method for organizing and keeping track of the text. So this is largely a process of what scholars call cutting and sorting. So before you begin your analysis, you're going to want to complete the following. So first, check your data. And specifically, you're going to be checking your data for multiple respondents, duplicate surveys, any type of information that may cause some errors or outliers in your data. So you're going to want to make sure that everything is as watertight as possible. Next, you need to add ID numbers. So add an ID number to each questionnaire, respondent, group, or site. You can even create a combination of those, so it may be easier to search in your database. But this will also help organize your information when you are looking at specific questions or specific respondents later on in your analysis. The final step is to prepare your data for analysis. So, for example, you may need to transcribe your taped interviews. How complete to make your transcription really does depend on your purpose and resources. So sometimes you may make a summary of what people say and analyze that. Other times you're going to want to have every word of the entire interview. Certainly as a researcher, I would prefer to have every word of the entire interview. But if you have 70 interviews, it's not very feasible to transcribe all 70 of those interviews word for word. So just a reminder that transcription is very time consuming. So be sure both the data quality and your use of the data are worth your time investment. Please make sure that you make copies of all your data, including hard copies and electronic files. This will give you one copy to work from and another for safekeeping. This is extremely important. I know several colleagues who only saved their data in one place and either ended up with corrupt files or having their laptops stolen, and I've seen a lot of heartbreak with this actual procedure. So it is in your best interest to make sure that you have hard copies of the data as well as several electronic files. Also, you need to identify the sources of all your data. So as you work with the data, you'll need to keep track of the source of the information or the context of the quotes. So such information really is critical to your analysis. So make sure you have a way to identify the source of all the data, such as by individual, site, and date. So for example, you may want to use or identify respondents by the group site, the county, a specific date, demographic variables, etc., etc. And later on in your analysis, you may want to compare and contrast these. And without identifying the different groupings, it becomes really difficult to identify the different types of information. There are some pitfalls that I do want to address in this presentation, and the first one is to avoid generalizing. The goal of qualitative work is not to generalize across a population. That's much more popular with quantitative analysis. Rather, qualitative seeks to provide understanding from the respondent's perspective. So we don't want to generalize certain assumptions all to different groups. Choosing your quotes carefully. So while using quotes can lead to valuable support to data interpretation, often these quotes are used that only directly support an argument or illustrate success. And this can lead to using people's words out of context or editing quotes to exemplify a point. And finally, address the limitations and alternatives. Every study has limitations, and presenting the problems or limitations you had while collecting and analyzing the data, it helps others better understand how you arrived at your conclusions. Finally, this is just a small snippet of what coding and categorizing can look like. Unfortunately, my color didn't come out very well in this particular diagram, but you can see the interviewer question, and it's followed by the responses of 4 individuals. You can see on the left-hand side of the screen where the margin is left blank, and you can write notes on the left-hand side, highlighting quotes for future use. Unfortunately, the color didn't come out there. And then also keeping notes on the right-hand side.